What's up, movie gang? Welcome back to Lights Camera Classics, the channel where we dig deep into those classic movies that your parents, or in this case your grandparents, probably grew up with. And let's be real, in the political climate we're in today, Russia is still a thing. But don't scroll just yet, because today we're talking about a Cold War comedy that's just as hilarious and surprisingly relevant today as it was back in the 1960s. I'm talking about Norman Jewison's The Russians Are Coming, The Russians Are Coming, a 1966 comedy that takes the paranoia of the Cold War and flips it on its head. So picture this, it's the mid-1960s. The US and the Soviet Union are locked in the Cold War. Everyone's worried about nuclear bombs, spy planes, and you guessed it, Russians sneaking into small-town America. Hollywood at this time was usually making serious Cold War thrillers, spy flicks, or even full-on propaganda. But director Norman Jewison thought, hey, why not make a comedy about it? Instead of a grim, the world is ending movie, The Russians Are Coming was like, what if we all just chilled out a little? And guess what? It worked. This movie ended up being a massive box office hit, earned 4 Oscar nominations, and proved that sometimes the best way to deal with fear is to laugh at it. Okay, let's get into the story. The film takes place on a tiny New England island. One night, a Soviet submarine, yep, a real submarine, accidentally runs aground just off the coast. The captain, played by Theodore Bikel, is like, we need to get this boat unstuck before anyone notices. So he sends a small crew led by Lieutenant Razanov, played by none other than Alan Arkin, in his breakout film role, into town to quietly borrow a boat. But here's the problem. This is a nosy little American town where nothing stays secret for long. The moment a few locals catch wind of Russians sneaking around, the panic sets in. Rumors fly. The Russians are invading. Pretty soon, the whole island is in chaos, convinced World War III is about to kick off right in their backyard. The comedy really comes from the misunderstandings. You've got Soviets who are just trying to get home, Americans who are freaking out, and a whole lot of slapstick chaos. There's even a wild sequence with town folks arming themselves with pitchforks, rifles, and whatever else they can find. And of course, you get those great small town character moments like the writer, played by Carl Reiner, whose family gets caught up in the madness. But by the end, the movie flips expectations. Instead of fighting, the Americans and Russians actually find common ground. There's this really sweet scene where both sides come together to save a little boy who's in danger. The message is clear. We're not so different after all. This film is stacked with talent. First, there's Alan Arkin. This was his first major movie role, and he steals the show as Lieutenant Razanov. His mix of frustration, charm, and awkwardness basically made him a star overnight. He even snagged an Oscar nomination for Best Actor. Then there's Carl Reiner, a comedy legend, father of Rob Reiner, and one of the brains behind the Dick Van Dyke Show. He plays Walt Whitaker, the everyman who's just trying to keep his family out of the madness. Eva Marie Saint is in it. You might recognize her from North by Northwest. Here she plays Elspeth Whitaker, Carl Reiner's wife, grounding the story with heart and humanity. Jonathan Winters is also in it, a comedy powerhouse of the time, playing the local deputy Norman Jones. He brings his signature chaotic energy, especially in scenes where the townsfolk get carried away. Brian Keith stars in this too. He plays the town police chief. He's the voice of reason, trying to keep everyone from spiraling into full-on hysteria. And let's not forget Theodore Bikel as the submarine captain. Stern, no nonsense, but still part of the absurdity. At its core, this movie is about fear and how ridiculous it can be when it spirals out of control. The Cold War made people suspicious of anyone different, but the film basically says, hey, these so-called enemies, they're just people too. It's satire, but with heart. Instead of painting the Russians as villains, it treats them like humans, sometimes clumsy, sometimes funny, sometimes heroic. That was actually pretty bold for 1966, when most Hollywood portrayals of Soviets were flat out scary or evil. So, how did audiences react? Well, the movie was a hit. People were ready to laugh at Cold War fears instead of crying about it. It was nominated for 4 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director for Jewison, Best Actor for Arkin, and Best Adapted Screenplay. Now, it didn't win those, but its legacy is solid. For one, it launched Alan Arkin's career. And 2, it showed that you can make a comedy about something as terrifying as the Cold War without trivializing it. It was satire with a purpose. In fact, the movie was so successful that it even got a nod from the Soviet Union. Rumor has it that Soviet officials actually approved of the way Russians were portrayed, not as faceless enemies, but as real, relatable people. That's a pretty big deal during a time when both nations weren't exactly on speaking terms. So why should you care about The Russians Are Coming in 2025? Well, for one thing, it's funny, like genuinely funny. Not just classic movie funny, but more importantly, it's a reminder that comedy can bridge divides. At a time when the world felt divided and scared, this movie showed that laughter and empathy could cut through the fear. It's part slapstick, part satire, part heartwarming family story, and honestly, that balance is what makes it timeless. And that's so Hollywood. So, if you've never seen it, track it down, grab some popcorn, and prepare to laugh at one of the most bizarre, almost invasions in movie history. The next time you're worried about the world ending, maybe what we all need is just a good laugh. Now, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop in the comments what classic comedy you want us to cover next. Until then, this is Movie Man Gary signing off, and remember,